All right, everyone, welcome. My name is Sari. I'm the rector here, and I'm going to just offer an opening prayer, and those of you who are joining us via Zoom, welcome. Opening prayer, and then I'll turn it over to Margaret, who will introduce our speakers today, and we'll get going. Whew, setting up the technology is like, that takes some time, so thanks for your patience. Let's pray. Loving God, we thank you for the gift of education and the statistics that we can learn from. Thank you, Lord, also for the personal stories and lives that have been impacted by gun violence and the willingness to share about those experiences. We ask, Lord, today that in this space you would create a space for learning, a space for compassion and understanding, and that it would be a space where we're inspired and moved to action. So bless our speakers today. And thank you, Lord, for everything that is about to transpire over the next hour. In your holy name we pray. Amen.
Thank you, Sari. Can you hear me? Great. Thank you, Sari. Thank you to everyone who's come in person. Really appreciate it. And thank you to everyone that's joining us by Zoom. And I'd also like to give a special thanks to Gary Dean, who is a gun owner in our parish. He's the person who really got us talking to gun owners. It's a dialogue that continues, and that was the inspiration for today's forum. I'd also like to thank Jody Tabner-Thayer, who is a psychologist who helped line up our speakers from EveryMind. And I'd like to thank our speakers. With us remotely, because she has strep throat, unfortunately, is Jessica Gilbertson. Jessica leads the Montgomery County chapter of Be SMART, which is a nonprofit organization under the umbrella of Moms Demand Action. Be SMART is a public health program that educates about safe gun storage and gun violence awareness. Jessica lives in Bethesda and is a mom to 3 small humans. So Jessica's presenting by Zoom, and I'm going to introduce all 3 speakers before Jessica Gilbertson speaks. Our second and third speakers who are speaking together and who are here right now, thank you so much. Thank you to Deepika Chung. She's the manager of crisis prevention services at EveryMind in Rockville, Montgomery County's only accredited Lifeline Center. The center answers calls, texts, and chats through the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline and the Montgomery County Hotline. With training and experience in journalism and communications, Ms. Chung is a passionate advocate for suicide prevention and mental health. She has written extensively on topics such as COVID's impact on the community and youth mental wellness. And I just remembered to take off my mask when I'm speaking. I hope you heard everything I said with my mask on. And you'll especially hear me now as I introduce Jessica Port, the operations manager for crisis prevention and intervention services at EveryMind, where she remains directly connected to crisis and suicide prevention work by doing frontline phone work on a weekly basis. Starting as a paraeducator working with children in need of support in the classroom, she quickly honed her training, creative thinking, and strategic crisis management skills, which she put to use as EveryMind's community schools coordinator. She advocates for social change and destigmatization on both the local and national levels. So thank you very much to Jessica, to Deepika, and to Jessica. And we'll start now by Zoom with Jessica Gilbertson.
Thank you so much. I'm really excited to be here today. I wish I could be there in person, but I'm going to keep my germs to myself and my own family. Today, we will be talking about Be SMART, which is a program developed by Moms Demand Action for Gun Sense in America to bring together parents and all adults concerned about kids, guns, and safety. I have been involved with Be SMART for about 4 years, since specifically February 14th, 2018. I was in South Florida on the beach with my family, and we started to hear sirens and get news alerts on our phones. And that was the Parkland shooting we were hearing. So since then, I decided that I needed to become more personally involved in this issue and became more involved in Moms Demand Action and specifically Be SMART. And before I get into it, can I share my slides, or is that something you all want to do from up there?
Yes, to share your screen.
Yeah.
Yes, you can.
Okay, great. So I'm gonna do that right now. And can you all see the screen?
Not yet.
Okay. I don't know why.
Okay, let's see. Wait, let's try one more time. Can you X out of what you were sharing and try sharing it again?
Sure.
Okay.
Okay. Okay.
Is that not happening? Okay, give me a second. Let me remove. Oh, there we go. Great.
Okay, perfect. All right. And do this. There we go. And that should look right.
Perfect.
Okay, thanks. In the US, firearms are the second leading cause of death for children and the first leading cause of death for Black children. As this slide shows, more than 1,600 children under the age of 18 are killed with guns in the US every year, an average of 5 children per day. When children in America are killed with guns, the majority of those deaths, 53%, are homicides. That's nearly 900 children per year. Another 700 children die by firearm suicide each year, and 90 are unintentionally shot and killed. We know that approximately 5.4 million children in the US live in a household with at least one loaded, unlocked gun. And this number has likely increased in light of the surge in gun sales during the COVID-19 pandemic. While school shootings and mass shootings typically make national headlines, the reality is that for children under the age of 13, gun homicides most frequently occur in the home. And one study showed that nearly 90% of unintentional shooting deaths and injuries among children under the age of 15 occur in the home. What's more, we know that in incidents of gunfire on school grounds, up to 80% of shooters under the age of 18 obtain the gun or guns they use from their home or the homes of relatives or friends. I know that this is an emotional issue, and we may come from different walks of life. Many of you may be parents, some are gun owners and some are not. You may have had a personal experience with guns, and some of you may have even been impacted by gun violence. We believe that most gun owners want to be responsible gun owners. So we are here today to talk about what all of us, gun owners and non-gun owners alike, can do to make sure children don't have unsupervised access to guns. For now, let's leave politics at the door and agree on these 3 things. 1, we all want kids to grow up happy and healthy. 2, we each have the right to make responsible decisions about how to protect our homes, families, and communities, including whether or not to have a gun in our home. And 3, if we can prevent even one child gun death or injury, it is our responsibility to do so. We're not here to talk about laws or policies, so we'll set those aside. I want to take a few minutes here to talk specifically about the consequences of unsecured guns and what it looks like. On this slide, you'll see just a few headlines from stories across the country, although we know there are many more and many incidents that go unreported. Some of you may remember from the news the first story in the top left. In January of 2018, there was a school shooting in Kentucky at Marshall County High School. More than a dozen students were shot and wounded. 2 of them, Bailey Holt and Preston Cope, were killed. The 16-year-old shooter had gained access to his stepfather's unsecured pistol from his bedroom. The next tragedy took place in May of 2018. A 4-year-old boy from Louisa, Virginia, unintentionally shot his 2-year-old brother Tyson after accessing an unsecured gun that was kept high in an upper cabinet. The next headline on the bottom left illustrates that when kids are looking to carry guns out of fear, easy access to guns can help facilitate the cycle of violence. Like 17-year-old Zeke of Jackson, Mississippi, who told the Jackson Free Press that some young people in his community carry guns out of fear of being robbed or shot, and believe that having a gun will allow them to defend themselves. Let me also point out our final story about 13-year-old Mikey from Brewster, New York. Mikey was a friendly, popular 8th grader. He was an expert bowler, an avid athlete, and loved video games. In January 2013, Mikey came home from school and took one of his father's unlocked loaded guns and shot himself. His family knew Mikey to be a happy kid, and they don't believe he had planned to die that day. But with easy access to a loaded gun, Mikey made an impulsive decision that tragically became a fatal one. All 4 of these stories show the fallout of when young people get their hands on unsecured guns. No story is quite the same, but all are tragic and all are preventable. It's important to remember that even if you are practicing secure storage, or if you don't have a gun in your home, you can't be sure about other homes. You can't be sure about how responsible other people are being. And that's where our Be Smart program becomes helpful. What can we do? We can learn to be smart. Let's start with S, secure your guns in homes and vehicles. 13 million households with children contain at least one gun. And the majority of children in gun-owning households know where the gun is stored. And we already know that in incidents of gunfire on school grounds, the majority of shooters under the age of 18 obtain the gun or guns from their homes or homes of others they're close to, like the tragedy that unfolded at Marshall County High School in Kentucky that we touched on earlier. What do I mean by securing guns? Guns should be stored locked and unloaded with ammunition stored separately. Hiding a gun is not securing a gun. And we know that can lead to tragedy. We talked about the 4-year-old Virginia boy who unintentionally shot his 2-year-old brother after accessing an unsecured gun that was just stored high in an upper cabinet. And remember Zeke from Mississippi, who spoke of the complicated safety reasons that push some teens to want a gun? Keep in mind that kids may feel a variety of emotions about guns, from curiosity to fascination to fear. It's our responsibility to prevent easy access to guns as the adults. Research also finds that secure storage is associated with a decreased risk of firearm suicide and unintentional firearm injury among children. One study showed that households that locked both firearms and ammunition had a 78% lower risk of self-inflicted firearm injuries among children and teenagers, and an 85% lower risk of unintentional firearm injuries. Some commonly used secure storage practices include using a cable lock, lockbox, or firearm safe, as well as storing firearms unloaded with ammunition stored separately. Unsecured guns also contribute to the staggering number of guns stolen each year. An estimated 380,000 guns are stolen from private gun owners every year, and gun owners were 3 times more likely to have a gun stolen if they carried a gun in the last month. Research also suggests that nearly 1/4 of stolen guns are taken from cars. So storing a gun in a glove compartment or underneath the seat in a car is not considered secure storage. Moving on to M, model responsible behavior. Every law-abiding adult has the right to decide whether or not to have a gun in the home, but you can't rely on curious kids not to find a gun. As we saw on the slide before, one study showed that the majority of children are aware of where their parents store guns, and that more than 1/3 reported handling their parents' guns, many doing so without the knowledge of their parents. Nearly 1/4 of parents did not know that their children had handled the gun in their home. It is always an adult's responsibility to prevent unauthorized access to guns, not a curious child's responsibility to avoid guns. Talk to your kids about gun safety, but remember that's a precaution, not a guarantee. One study found that young children who go through a week-long gun safety program are just as likely as children with no training to approach or play with a handgun when they find one. Modeling responsible behavior means that smart adults make sure that kids don't have the opportunity to access guns. That said, you can't control the environment that your child is in all the time. So you should teach them not to touch a gun if they come across one, real or pretend, and give them the tools to get out of a dangerous situation and alert an adult. As an adult, it's your responsibility to do everything you can to prevent them from getting into a dangerous situation to begin with. We do have handouts on many issues, such as talking to children and teens about guns, that we can always send around. A, we already know there are approximately 5.4 million children in the US living in a household with at least one loaded unlocked gun. That's why you need to ask about firearms in other homes your child visits, or the A in SMART. For the parents and caretakers, you may already be asking several questions before allowing your child to go to a friend's or another person's home. For example, you may ask about potential allergens or pets in the home, any pools on the property, car seats for rides, who will be home for either play dates or teen events, screen time, alcohol access, etc. Asking about guns in the home should be as natural as asking about any other safety issue, but it can definitely seem awkward at first. So try making it part of your general safety conversation. You might try asking via email or text if you're more comfortable with that at first. We also have a handout with examples of conversations, asking about secure storage if you're interested. Let's talk about recognizing the role of guns in suicide, the R. Access to a gun can mean the difference between life and death. We saw that in Mikey's story. As our children get older, you may need to consider taking another look at your storage methods. If you've been using a simple cable lock, you may want to think about getting a gun safe. We all know how curious children can be. So as they get older and more resourceful, we need to act accordingly. Also, if you know your loved one is in distress, you might want to consider temporarily removing a gun from your home. Take this information into consideration. Most people who attempt suicide do not die unless they use a gun. In fact, 90% of suicide attempts with a gun result in death, a much higher fatality rate than any other means of self-harm. This contributes to the fact that 40% of child suicides involve a gun. If you can consider temporarily removing a gun from your home, how can you do that? Where can you bring it? Well, local law enforcement here in Maryland is generally willing to store your guns under the ERPO law. Some licensed gun dealers or gun ranges may be willing to temporarily store your guns, or you could temporarily store your guns in the home of a friend or family member. But to manage risk for that friend or family member, you should lock any guns that you transfer and do not provide the key or the code. The National Youth Survey conducted by the CDC showed that 17% of high school students surveyed had seriously considered attempting suicide within the last year. One study showed that 41% of adolescents in gun-owning households report having easy access to the guns in their home. As we discussed earlier, research shows that secure firearm storage, is associated with a decreased risk of child firearm suicide. We have another handout with more information, facts, and resources on child firearm suicide and it includes the suicide prevention hotline. T, tell, that is the power of being smart. We've heard from people that because of Be Smart, they know to ask about the presence of guns before their children go to other people's homes, that they have talked to family members about guns in homes they visit. They have recognized the role of guns in suicide, and that gun owners are modeling responsible behavior as a direct result of Be Smart. It's important that people who own and work with guns are part of this conversation. Research shows that law enforcement, the military, and hunting or outdoor groups are particularly effective at communicating safe storage practices. So, who are you going to tell to be smart today? Thank you so much for giving me some of your time here today. Feel free to reach out if you have any questions or want to become more involved directly with Be Smart. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much, Jessica. That was great. And one thing I forgot to mention, Jessica told us quite a bit about the importance of secure storage of firearms. And I just wanted to point out that Jan McNamara, Jan, can you stand up for just a minute? If anyone here wants a cable lock, a trigger lock for your own firearms, or if you have a loved one that you wish would lock up their weapons, please see Jan and get a lock from her. And we have more locks also. If you need a lock, you can just contact me anytime. Also, Jessica mentioned temporarily removing your firearm if you're in distress or if a loved one has a firearm. Jan also has a handout with some local gun shops and law enforcement agencies that will temporarily take the firearm away. Thank you, Jan. And now let's hear from Jessica and Deepika.
Is it unmuted? Is Justin? Can you make sure this is?
Good morning, everyone. Welcome to our presentation today on gun safety and suicide prevention. My name is Deepika Chung. I'm the manager at Crisis Prevention and Intervention Services at EveryMind. EveryMind is Montgomery County's mental health services provider. We are a nonprofit organization. We are apolitical. So our talk today will focus on mental health and ways to reduce firearm suicide based on data and best practices. So none of what we speak about today should be taken as a commentary on the Second Amendment or gun laws. I'm here with my colleague, Jessica Port.
Hi, thank you as well for joining us. My name is Jessica Port. I'm the operations manager for the Montgomery County Suicide Prevention Hotline. And my job is mainly to make sure that things are running smoothly over at the hotline, which is quite a task. Not quite as hard as scheduling, which is what Deepika handles, but quite a task. Thank you again for joining us. I did want to say that I married somebody who is a veteran and grew up in the South, and very much part of their culture is hunting and guns, and it sort of builds into the culture. And my parents are from Brooklyn. I grew up in suburban New Jersey, and that's very much not my culture. Suffice to say, we do own a gun. That happened after a lot of really long conversations and research, and we also have an 8-year-old. So we are very proud of how we secure our gun, which is in a locker that is bolted to the wall inside of one of our closets, which is also locked. We keep our ammo separate from our gun, and it is a shotgun because shotguns are much less likely to be accidental shootings as opposed to handguns, which are very easy to engage. So it is possible to have very different views and come to an agreement on gun ownership and gun storage. We do disclose whenever somebody is going to have a play date at our house that we do have a gun, and we talk about how we store it, and we let them make a decision on whether or not that it suffices for them and their family and their thoughts. It also gets people comfortable having that conversation, and it's just a nice reminder not to assume that people don't have a gun, or if they do, that they have stored it correctly. So I wanted to put that out there, just a little personal piece, that it is possible to work in suicide prevention and be married to a veteran and still have a gun and come to terms on that.
So conversations surrounding crisis and suicide can be very overwhelming. It can be triggering sometimes. So if you do feel like that you need a break from this conversation, please feel free to step outside or stop streaming. We promise we won't take offense. We support your decision to look after your mental health first. So having said that, let's go right into some statistics. Sure. Cool. Let's look at some figures that will show us why gun safety is so vital when it comes to suicide prevention. In 2019, there were 47,000 suicide deaths in the United States. Just over half of those were deaths by firearm. So when we think about gun violence, we often think about like gang violence or mass shootings or other horrific crimes. But actually, the truth is over 60% of gun deaths are suicides. So if we are really serious about tackling gun violence, there is really no circumventing talking about firearm suicides and how lethal they are. I think Jessica just previously touched on it. 85 to 90% of suicide attempts by guns end up in the person's death. Whereas if we compare to suicide attempts by medication, overdosing on medication, only 3% of those attempts will be successful. So we can see that firearm suicide attempts are extremely, extremely lethal. So while most suicide crises are temporary, having easy access to a lethal mean, like having a gun, really introduces an element of finality that cannot be reversed. So to put it very simply, having access to an unlocked gun increased a person's chances of dying by suicide by 300%. So keeping these statistics in mind, we have cause to worry about the recent firearm sales surge during the pandemic. In March 2020, 2 million firearms were sold in the US. Between the first 4 months of the pandemic, January 2020 to April 2020, America gained 2.5 million new gun owners. So with these statistics, we are it cannot be more timely to talk about suicide prevention. So we just want to be very, very clear. Only owning a gun doesn't make a person suicidal. It just vastly increases the chance of the person dying by suicide if they have suicidal ideation. So what caused a person to have suicidal ideation? We often hear people talk about suicide is the easy way out, right? It's a cowardly act. You just don't want to deal with your issues. Actually, nothing can be further from the truth. A person who attempts suicide has to overcome their own survival instinct. They have to overcome their fear of pain and death. It is not an easy thing to do, and it is not a flippant decision. Many times the person is experiencing tremendous emotional pain. They don't necessarily want to die, but they do not see another way to get out of that unbearable, insufferable pain that they are experiencing. A lot of times, the person is also experiencing an acute sense of loneliness, isolation. They lack a meaningful connection to other human beings. A lot of times we will hear them talking to us on the suicide hotline saying that no one cares whether I live or die. No one understands me. I'm all alone. One thing to note is that do not assume a person is not suffering from isolation or loneliness just because they're surrounded by people. Just because they are not physically alone doesn't mean that they don't feel isolated. We've all seen lonely people on the metro, in the parks, at schools, so something to keep in mind. Another thing that we hear very often on the suicide hotline from suicidal individuals is a feeling of burdensomeness. They feel like that their lives are worthless. They are burdened on their friends, on their family, sometimes on society. They think that people are better off without them. These comments may sound very casual, something that people throw around all the time, but actually they come from a place of deep, deep hurt. And we need to listen when someone says things like that, and we mustn't just discard it as just flippant comments. So over time, the struggle simply becomes too much. The thought and the fear of continuing to suffer outweighs the fear of pain and death. When it gets to this point, suicide to the person may seem like a good or even rational decision. So once a person decides that they need to end their life, not everyone will act on it. A lot of people have passing suicidal thoughts they don't attempt. But out of all the people that do act on that decision, 73% of them will act within the first 1 hour and a half. So during this acute suicidal phase, the person is going through something experts call amygdala hijack. At this point, they are feeling there's cortisol, adrenaline running through their body. At the same time, the ability to problem solve actually goes down. That is something that we want to use to our advantage in suicide prevention. If we can put up some deliberate barriers between the person and the lethal mean during that phase, many times the attempt won't be successful. So that is something that we really, really want to think about, how that can potentially save lives. Of course, in an ideal world, we would like to get the gun and ammunition, all of it, out of the house and away from the suicidal person, and to put it in safekeeping of a loved one or a trusted friend. But we recognize that sometimes that's not possible, or it is not something that the person is willing or able to do. Sometimes the firearm can be a family heirloom. It has sentimental value to the person. Sometimes owning a gun is intrinsic to the identity of the gun owner. So what can we do? Jessica touched on several things, several ways to safely store our guns. When you can lock the gun away is good. Even better if you can give the key away to somebody else. We would like to see that. But if even that is not possible, we have to start thinking outside the box. So some of the ways that we have had success of on the suicide hotline, sometimes we recommend the gun owner to disassemble the gun and put different pieces of the gun all over the house. So that prevents a person from acting on their suicidal thoughts on an impulse. Sometimes we would ask them to store a reminder of their reason to stay alive with their ammunition or with the gun or with part of the gun, or the key to their gun lock. What are reminders to stay alive? That can be a picture of your children, a picture of your pets. It could be a card from your spouse, some mementos that brings back happy memories. Even just the telephone number, the number to call the suicide hotline, to keep that there to remind you at that moment of crisis that there are help and hope out there. Another funny anecdote that we have had success of is to recommend a person to store their key to their gun lock or their ammunition in a big block of ice in the freezer. It takes time to thaw out a big block of ice. If any of you have ever taken frozen chicken out of the freezer and want to make dinner, it's not that easy. So that can buy us precious time. Another thing that we can recommend is there are companies out there that produce decorative vinyl gun wraps. So to some people, like stickers that you can stick on your gun to personalize it. Sometimes it's good to put pictures of your children or your other reasons for living on that gun wrap. There is a nonprofit organization called Cover Me Veterans that will do that free of charge for any veterans. So, conversations about gun safety is not easy. When you have to talk to a friend or somebody you're concerned about, make sure that you remind them that you're doing this because you care about them. You're worried about them because of these reasons, because something that you've seen them do or say. There's an analogy that can sometimes be useful during these conversations. That is the analogy of drinking and driving. You won't let a friend or family member get behind the wheels when they are drunk. If you have a friend or family member who is acutely suicidal, we don't want them to have access to a gun either. Sometimes that can help people understand why we're doing or saying what we're doing and saying. It's always important to remember that giving up access to their gun is only temporary. The crisis will pass. It is not forever. I'm going to hand over the mic to our guest.
Thank you. So we've given you a lot of information and a whole lot of statistics, and I know that that is a lot to process. So I wanted to get us up and moving a little bit. There are lots of myths around suicide and around gun ownership. So if you believe that this is a fact, I'm going to ask you to stand. And if you believe that it is a myth, stay seated. So fact, stand up. Myth, stay seated. Asking a person if they are thinking of suicide will put the idea in their head. Is that a fact? If it is, please stand. If that is a myth, please stay seated. Fantastic. You guys are incredible, and that usually does it for these, but I appreciate it. You guys are a well-educated group when it comes to that. All right. The cause of suicidal behavior cuts across socioeconomic boundaries. If that is a fact, please stand up, and if it is a myth, please stay seated. That is correct. Good job. Yes, thoughts of suicide and suicidal behavior does not care what race, ethnicity, or background you come from. Those thoughts can come on, unfortunately, for any of us. If you take away a method from someone, they will likely find a different method to kill themselves. If you believe that is a fact, stand up. If you believe it is a myth, stay seated. So we're a little mixed on this one. So generally, you guys can sit, thank you. So it is a myth. Generally, people have an idea in the back of their heads. So the act of suicide is often an impulsive act, but that does not mean that they have not had ideation and thought about it for possibly years and planned it very carefully. It's just that the day that they choose to actually carry out a suicide was an impulsive decision, sort of like the idea of the straw that breaks the camel's back. So you can be under a lot of stress and pain and emotional pain and hurt, and then make that decision in a very short split second that you're going to end things today. So a lot of people may have a thought in their head of, well, I can do this today, or if things become too much for me, I can die by suicide. So for them, it's a comfort to think about possibly dying and the way that they would die, and planning it is a comfort for them. So very rarely when you take away that one method that they have been planning as their escape, do they go ahead and find a different method. So that was a super tricky one. All right. If you believe this is a fact, please stand up. If it is a myth, please stay seated. Spirituality can be a protective factor for young adults, keeping them from developing a mental illness or minimizing the impact of the illness. If you believe that is a fact, please stand up. If you believe that is a myth, please stay seated. You are correct. Places like this very church, you guys can sit, places like this church and this community, more importantly, is a protective factor. When young adults in particular feel connected to their community, when they have adults they can talk to, when they have a sense of spirituality that leads them to feel a part of something larger, it can be a protective factor in developing some mental illnesses and minimizing the impact of illnesses. All right, we have a couple more. Okay, if this is a fact, please stand up. If it's a myth, stay seated. Most suicides happen around the winter holiday season. You're like half standing up, yeah. Thank you. That is actually a myth. And I know that there's seasonal affective disorder and some other like higher rates of depression and stuff around the winter holidays, but that actually is not true. It is often springtime. But season change in general can be an adjustment for a lot of people who are struggling. All suicide attempts must be treated as though the person has the intent to die. I'll read that one again because it's a little tricky. All suicide attempts must be treated as though the person has the intent to die. That is a fact. Please stand up. If it's a myth, stay seated. It is a fact. So thank you to those of you who stood. A lot of times, especially with young adults, with teens, we hear a lot, they're just doing it for attention. So here's the deal. If you feel the only way to get the attention you need for the pain you are in is to let the people around you know that you are thinking about suicide, even if you are not thinking about suicide, we need to assume that you are, because that is very intense. And if you cannot get attention in any other manner, but asking people and telling them that you're thinking of dying by suicide, then there's much larger issues going on. So we take it very seriously every single time. All right, last two. Suicide attempts or deaths happen without warning. This is super complicated because I gave you some conflicting information earlier. If you believe it is a fact, please stand up. If you believe it is a myth, stay seated. Okay, so thank you. It is actually a myth. So there are lots of warning signs when somebody is having suicidal ideation and planning to die. So even if that attempt or death happens, that decision to die happens in a short period of time and impulsively, the thoughts have been there for a while and they may have been doing things like, who has some ideas, if you are comfortable sharing, of things that a person who is thinking about suicide may do before they act on those actions, or those thoughts, sorry. So some of those are giving away prized possessions. I know a lot of you have probably heard that. That is definitely true. Maybe talking to one of their children about their financial situation, talking about bank accounts, where money is kept, those sorts of things. Those are all somebody who is possibly taking medication for a mental illness, and they have a very quick change of behavior. Any kind of change of behavior or mood is something to be aware of. So if somebody's been very, very depressed for a long time, and all of a sudden they just start feeling better, sometimes that's because medication and treatment is working, and sometimes that is because they have decided that they are going to die, and that has given them a lot of relief, and they now feel like they have the energy to carry through with the plan. So always be aware if somebody's behavior changes. Yes? Sure. Yes. Thank you. I really appreciate you being vulnerable and sharing something personal with us. And I'm really sorry for your loss. And I believe you're absolutely correct. There are warning signs that a lot of times people miss, but all of us are susceptible to events happening in our lives that make us feel entirely overwhelmed and like we can't do this anymore. So no one is immune to suicidal thoughts or ideations. We don't know what's coming in the future. Really intense things happen without warning. All of a sudden, our worlds collapse, and suicide becomes a consideration for people. So we should always be aware for ourselves and for the people around us of any warning signs we may see. And you are correct, it is not an excuse not to secure means and not to continue having these really tough conversations. The only effective intervention for suicide comes from professional psychotherapists with experience in the area. This is our last one. The only effective intervention for suicide comes from professional psychotherapists with experience in the area. If you believe that is true, please stand up. If not, please stay seated. Great, you all stayed seated, yes. So the reason why we are all here is, it is great if somebody is able to get care from a therapist, but all of us can help prevent suicide. All of us can take steps to support the people in our lives. How to support a suicidal person. Okay, talk to them in private. That is huge. You want to take a moment when neither of you are running around to do something, you're not heading off to practice, you're not going to do this or that, and take a minute and just start a casual conversation in private that says something like, I'm worried about you, or you haven't really seemed like yourself lately. Is everything okay? Any of these just sort of real basic checking in, no pressure conversations, but when you pull somebody in private, they know that you are giving them your undivided attention and that you care about them and you're reaching out. You want to listen to their story. This is very hard for all of us. It is very hard when you know somebody you love is in pain to just sit quietly and listen to what's going on. And I encourage you to do that, not just in these intense conversations, but in general, to do your best to take a moment and try to just listen to what somebody is telling you before they respond. And ways you can do that is to sit quietly, to nod, to say, and just agree with some verbal nods, and say things like, I'd really like to hear more about that. Or just to validate some of their feelings or thoughts. That seems really overwhelming. Wow, it seems like there's been a lot of stress in your life recently. Thanks for sharing. Tell them you care about them. So during this tough conversation that might just be about all of the things going wrong in their lives, which can be something that you might find to be super menial, the car broke down, and for you that just doesn't seem like that big of a crisis, but to them it's affecting them deeply and it is a crisis. So I really appreciate you opening up to me. Thanks so much for trusting me. A simple, I love you, I really care about you. Those are really powerful things when somebody is opening up and talking. And then this is the hard part. Ask directly if they're thinking about suicide. Earlier we had the myths and facts section, and we know that this is not going to put the idea in their head. And if somebody is not suicidal, they are not going to be offended that you asked. But if somebody is, they are going to have a huge sigh of relief. And we hear it all the time on the hotline. When we say something like, you've been going through so much recently, that can be really heavy. And sometimes when we're going through something so heavy, our thoughts go to a really dark place. Are you thinking of suicide? And the person will take a pause and then go, yeah, actually. And it's this huge relief, and it lets some of the air out of the balloon and a little bit of pressure in the room, and then we can get to the real conversations. So asking directly, not harming yourself, not hurting yourself, suicide, the actual words. Maybe if you're talking with somebody younger, you could say killing yourself along those lines, but those actual words have a lot of power, and it also tells them that if they're not suicidal today, you're somebody who is comfortable with this topic, and they can tell you if that changes. Or if they know somebody who might be thinking of suicide, you are a safe person to have that conversation with. Yes?
Would you, sorry.
I just want to make sure everybody can hear the questions. So, would you say, use the word suicide, or would you say, like, does it make a difference if you say, are you thinking about taking your own life? Or is there something about the word suicide specifically that you're saying?
So for us on the hotline, we use suicide, but we also say killing yourself, taking your life, anything like that. We just want to really try to avoid euphemisms like hurting yourself or harming yourself, because those are very different things than suicide. I'm sure you guys have heard about like non-suicidal self-injury and self-harm, that kind of stuff, and we're not asking about that. In this conversation, we're asking about suicide. Did you have anything to add on that?
And it's also to do with the age of the person. If we're speaking to a child, sometimes they will say something like, I just don't want to be living anymore or alive anymore. We have to listen out for that when we are talking to little children.
And also using their words back at them. When you say you don't want to wake up tomorrow, are you thinking about suicide? Are you, just to be on the same page, are you talking about dying by suicide? Are you talking about taking your life? Those kinds of questions, and just reframing what they say. So that way also, if they're not thinking of suicide, they know that you didn't just pull that out of nowhere. They said something that made you curious, and that's why you asked. Encourage them to seek treatment or contact their doctor or therapist and or an adult if under 21. So we say under 21, not 18, because 21 is still very much not an adult in some ways. You know, your brain isn't fully developed. You're not necessarily thinking the way an adult does. And also your friend group and the people around you are also all about 2021. So that being said, it's really important that you get an adult involved. And you want it to be somebody that you think that they would trust. So obviously if they're coming to you, you're that adult. Great. But if a kid comes to you and says, so-and-so is thinking about taking their life, and this is a person under 21, you're gonna want to try to get some, and you're not that person for them. You're maybe outside of that social circle. You're gonna wanna get maybe their parent involved if that's somebody that seems like that would be a good move. And you're gonna wanna see if you can help support the family in getting in touch with the doctor or therapist. Oftentimes that question can come up of, so, you know, you've been dealing with a lot of stress and a lot of things have been going on in your life. You deserve to have support. Have you been able to talk to anybody else about this? So, you know, it's a really nerve-wracking thing to feel like you're that person and have all of that pressure. So it's helpful to find if they've talked to anybody else, and now you're beginning to form a support team, a support network. Yes, I have a therapist. I've talked to my therapist. Okay, great. Can we get on the phone with your therapist? Can I come with you to one of your meetings with your therapist? Can we maybe involve does your primary doctor know? That kind of stuff, and it can lead to creating a support system for this person. And then lastly, we have some things you should avoid. This conversation, even though it may make you think very deeply about life and why we're here and greater purpose and God, you're going to want to avoid debating the value of life. This is not the time to have that conversation. Minimizing their problems, like I said earlier, even if it doesn't feel like a crisis to you, it definitely feels like a crisis to them. Using guilt or giving advice. And these are the things that we generally do in our everyday life when we're talking to people. They come to you with a problem and immediately the wheels start turning. Have you tried this? Have you thought about? So you have so many wonderful things in your life. What about your kids? How could you do this to your kids? Anything involving spirituality that would be negative, like if you do that, you're going to go to hell. Any of those things we definitely want to avoid in these conversations because they're just not productive. People who are suicidal need to feel heard, need to feel supported, and need to feel like they can open up on those sorts of things. And also comparing it to your own experiences. So, you know, we've all had bad breakups. We've all had any of these things that could lead somebody to feel suicidal. Money troubles, those sorts of things that you may be able to relate to, but it is not helpful or productive in this conversation to talk about yourself or try to pull the focus onto yourself, because even if you're being supportive, the suicidal person may not see it that way.
Okay, so hotline is always looking for volunteers. Anybody that lives in the DMV area over the age of 18, we welcome you into our hotline training. It teaches a lot of skills from listening, supportive listening, how to support a suicidal person, how to de-escalate crisis, how to give people resources, how to stage intervention. All of these are valuable skills that we teach during our hotline training. If anybody is interested, please email us at EveryMind. Oh.
Ah, sorry. That's okay.
Please email us at hotline@every-mind.org.
Is it, did it not? We have handouts that I think you guys might get. You can get in touch with yes, please, you can get in touch with the organizers to get our individual emails. We're happy to answer it. You can email us at hotline@every-mind.org. And also, what I will say on a personal level, hotline training has been incredible for me as a friend, as a partner, as a parent, in all different ways, because it's taught me how to, I've always had natural empathy. I'm sure many of you do, because you're here for this talk as well. And obviously you want to help and support your community because you're here, and it has given me the opportunity to do that in a different way. Even having empathy is just not enough. You have to learn how to talk to people and listen in a way that makes people feel supported, and that is what you learn to do in hotline training. So I recommend it for absolutely everyone. And just this weekend, I was working with my son's PTA, and we did a 5K run. And one of my jobs is supposed to be a super easy lift where I write down the winners and I walk it over to the mayor and he announces them. And it was utter chaos and things were going awry, and they couldn't get the timing right. And it was really, really intense. And my hotline training kicked right in and I talked to everybody like I was listening and supportive, and we got through the crisis. And I felt like the crisis training helped me, as well as some of the people skills you learn, so that people don't feel dismissed when they're very, very frustrated of things that they can't control. So it has helped me in every facet of my life. So I really do believe that it's a great training. So if you have availability, you should, and come and join us on the hotline. We're a lot of fun, even though it's a very serious topic. We have a Slack channel. We talk a lot about self-care. We post pictures of our pets and our gardening projects, just because we do such intense work. So it's important to have that community to back us all up. Oh, did you? Yes.
Were you done with your presentation? Oh, all right. We're a bit over time, so I'd like to say, if anyone wants to leave, please, let's just thank our speakers very much, Jessica and Deepika and Jessica Gilbertson. Hopefully Jessica can hear us clapping here on Zoom and see us. If anyone would like to stay on, I think our presenters will stay on. And also, people, if you have questions later, or your question doesn't get answered, all three, I have their emails. They've all agreed to respond to any follow-up questions by email. So does anyone here in the room or on Zoom, I don't know if you've been sending questions in chat, does anyone have any questions for our EveryMind presenters or related to Be Smart? Going once, going twice. We are over time. Thank you so much for your patience. Thank you for listening. Thanks to Sari for the technology help. And thank you so much to Deepika, Jessica, and Jessica. And if you need a lock, Jan has locks. Thank you.